welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis and I am your host. I'm releasing this episode on July 4th, 2022, and it's a special sort of content. I wanted to do a little historical reflection on some events in the founding of the United States. Particularly, I wanted to reflect on Washington's crossing of the Delaware. Now, the reason I wanted to reflect on this was a variety of things. I think I saw someone talking about it the other day on Twitter, and it kind of got me thinking, and I think it can be helpful to look back at historical episodes and explore some implications for how we think about Christianity, culture, and politics. Now, the danger, of course, is when we look to history, we're not just trying to pull from history to justify our beliefs, and we're not trying to moralize or fableize different episodes in history. But as we use principles today for either cultural engagement or a variety of issues, I think it can be really helpful to use those principles and go look at how we might examine past Christians. And so one of those is the founding of the United States. There's an interesting book called Justifying Revolution, which came out a couple of years ago, and it discusses the religious and pastoral approaches to dealing with revolution, and particularly the American Revolution, not so much the French. And I believe the author differentiates between the American Revolution, which was more, I don't know if he uses the word traditional, but it definitely wasn't French. And so this episode of Washington crossing the Delaware is a curious one that sparks kind of my interest in several ways. And so on the night of Christmas, 1776, what we get is we have Washington preparing to cross. He rallies the troops, musters the troops, and he is preparing to go cross the Delaware. It begins to snow. There is ice in the river. It's a pretty precarious journey, and you have this famous painting where he's kind of captaining, or at least on the front of a boat, and they're navigating through ice to cross the Delaware. They've got their horses and all the different things. And so it's Christmas. You think of these presumably Christians. Washington was an Anglican, and while religion wasn't a thing he was necessarily known for, it wasn't like that was his primary vocation. It was something he was known to be religious and Anglican. And so we've got an Anglican general leading the army of rebels, and they're going to cross the Delaware. They're going to attack the Hessians. The Hessians are mercenaries hired by the British from Germany, and they're Germans, presumably Christian as well. And they are on the other side, and they're celebrating Christmas. And Washington decides that night that in the midst of the evening of Christmas, he's going to go, and on December 26th, he launches an attack against the Hessians. Well, the Americans only lose about 3 men, and I believe, I'm going to pull it up real quick, the Hessians lost 22 were killed, 98 wounded, and then 1,000 prisoners were captured. And so this episode is really interesting as we think back on July 4th, 1776. The reason it's interesting is I kind of want to pull out 3 strings from it. One, you've got rebels against a state. You've got them trying to form their own kind of nation or statehood, and they're claiming independence. So this is 6 months around after their Declaration of Independence. And so you've got Christians living under presumably a Christian empire, the British Empire, and they've decided to declare independence from it, and then they decide to fight for that independence. And so you've got an interesting situation there where a lot of Christians will say, well, violence should only be justified based on, certain things. If it was nation versus nation, if there was political powers already established that have made legal, just war decisions. And so I don't know that they were using just war theory, although they might have. I haven't looked closely enough at that. So that's the first thing, is you've kind of got a unique situation where you've got citizens of an empire rebelling against that empire to declare independence from that empire, and they're Christians. Many of them. I mean, that's the framework they're coming from. They're led by a Christian man. The second thing is you've got Christians fighting Christians. So a lot of times when we think about war and we think about different nations fighting different nations, we tend to forget that we either want to put God on one side, which, you can look at Old Testament passages where God doesn't claim to be on one side, but God is always on the side of good and righteousness. And so when you get wars, especially when Christianity was more prevalent in Western Europe, you get Christians fighting Christians. And the reason this is interesting is it would be one thing if Christians were fighting, let's say, pagans or not Christians. But then you get Christians fighting Christians, and I think a lot of Christians today would look back and, based on principles we use today, view that as very abhorrent, unprincipled, and unethical, unchristian to do that. And so you've got Christians crossing in the middle of the night to go kill and defeat other Christians in war. That's a very complicated ethical situation. I think a lot of times we look back at historical episodes and we're like, well, there must not have been any Hessian Christians, and there were only, or British Christians, there were only American Christians. And we can lie to ourselves and try to cleanse history from the very complex nature of people and religion and ways they identified. And so I think for a lot of us today, the episode of Washington crossing Delaware, the whole Revolutionary War, would make us very uncomfortable. And you could even tease that out into areas like the Civil War, when our nation fought against itself and citizen versus citizen, and there were Christians on both sides. And so now you've got Christians killing other Christians over certain matters, particularly that matter being slavery in the Civil War. And that kind of ties back to the Revolutionary War, when they were declaring independence from Britain, from England, from the British Empire. They were doing so over matters today which I think many of us would consider fairly innocuous and not worth using the sword to resist. So if you look at the reasons why they were declaring independence, one of the big ones was taxation without representation, and you saw this come up over and over again, was the taxing of the people. And so by today's standards, if there was a pastor or a group of people in the United States who were to suggest we should, secede or rebel or declare our independence based on taxes, I think there would be a lot of pastors today, Christians today, scholars today, who would kind of get their panties in a wad over that. We may like to celebrate the 4th of July and declaring independence today, and we're all going to, do fireworks and other such things on the 4th of July. But if we really dig into the ethical reasoning of how they declared independence and why, I don't know that many of us would have signed that document. And that should give us pause. My point in bringing that up is maybe we should consider what principles we're employing today, and how we think about political engagement, cultural engagement, powers, and how we think about civil disobedience, all these different matters. And so, you can talk about all the ways that their rights were violated, but those rights weren't even established. They were establishing those rights. So it was much more complex, and we love to celebrate this day, or I think a lot of people do, because the United States is historically a wonderful country with great freedoms, and that's why a lot of people want to live here and move here and make a life here. It's been very blessed in a lot of different ways, but we can look back on history and we forget that based on the principles we use today for engaging on taxes, for example, I don't know that many of us would have been comfortable signing that document, and we wouldn't have felt justified in using the sword to resist the state in that way. And so really, I guess this kind of brief episode, I just wanted to really highlight that we shouldn't, as people today, living today in the 21st century, think that we've moved on from the 20th century so quickly and think that we're that much better than those people who came before us. We shouldn't buy into conceptions and principles of biblical Christianity, which really butcher history and make ourselves the only true Christians who have ever existed. And I think a lot of us have this historical snobbery, where we look back at history and we think, well, those guys didn't have it all together. Those guys had no idea what they were doing. We know so much more now, and we're more pure Christians and righteous Christians today. And when we have that attitude, we're not going to be able to really sit under history and learn from it. And so I just wanted to bring up this really heroic effort by Washington, crossing the Delaware in the middle of the night on a frozen river to go wage war and achieve victory. This is a very awesome thing that he does. It's a very fantastic thing that he does to lead the army, a very courageous thing. It mimics a strong and courageous thing to do in war. And this was done by a Christian man in the effort of resisting an empire. And so history is much more complex. And the reason I love studying history, and I want to inspire you to study history, is when we use our principles today and we put them under the weight of history, well, we start to see that maybe the principles we're using today to engage and to think through matters, maybe they are not built on firm foundations. And maybe there's people who have come before us who have thought through these matters and done so with deep conviction and actually fought using the sword against the state which bears the sword. So it's a very complex issue. I want you to have a great 4th of July, and I want you to celebrate and appreciate our history and where we've come from. If you're an American, if you're not American, I would love for you to celebrate for us as we celebrate Independence Day. And next week we're going to have an episode with Samuel Parkinson. He's going to be a returning guest, and I'm excited to talk with him. He's going to be talking with me on issues such as abortion, empathy, and we're going to talk about desire at the end, but we're going to be talking through his book. So stay tuned for that. That's coming out in a week. But until then, see you next time.